So today, what we're going to go ahead and take a look at, I know, I'm sure some of you were here, I think with Lino mentioned that Shakib was kind of the last one to present. He's kind of the universal theme master. But there are some features of the universal theme, sometimes as you work with it so much, and as you work with any product, you kind of things that you might take for granted, or things that are just so core to what you know about it. Sometimes you forget to talk about it. So one of the things that this talk kind of is geared towards is trying to take a look at the universal theme. So it's kind of in that same realm, but trying to talk about and look at some features that maybe don't get a lot of attention, and why they are important still, and just a kind of peripheral information around that concept. As Lino mentioned, I am Tyson Juglé. I've been an Apex developer for 10 years. And one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is that I'm an instructor and a developer, right? So I don't just do consulting, and I don't just do training. I get to do both. And one of the advantages that I think that has is that, well, we can look at, I have kind of a practical sense of discussion about kind of what we would actually use, right? Not just things you would theoretically use, but things I think that would actually apply to your daily life. And those are the things that that I like to talk about, and kind of things that hopefully can help enhance your applications and the things that you build. What are we going to talk about today? Well, one of the first things we're going to look at are just some kind of core technologies that surround the universal theme, and some features that it provides. The other thing that we're going to take a look at is, I think, one of my favorite things about the universal theme, in the sense that and I think this is kind of one of the things that's touted or demonstrated, but not really talked about technically, are the media queries, and the concept of media queries, and how they work in making your application presentable and look really nice, regardless of the size of the viewport or the size of the browser that's viewing the application. Another thing we're going to look at is BEM, Block Element Modifier. And BEM is just an idea. It's a concept. It's nothing you have to download. It's nothing extra you have to install. It's just a way of thinking, in particular, a way of thinking about CSS and how it's incredibly, incredibly helpful. And then there's some JavaScript stuff that we're going to take a look at, in terms of, there are some APIs that you can invoke, some things we're going to look at there. And yeah, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun while we look at that. So what exactly is a media query, and why do we care about it? Well, a media query basically is a way that you can write CSS to respond to different screen resolutions. And so one of the things that's become just so core to how we write applications now is this ability to, well, need to make sure that the application works well for a desktop computer, but also works well for a mobile device. And kind of media queries are the tool that we use to make that happen. And one of the ways that you kind of see Apex use this functionality, or at least you kind of can view the results of Apex using this functionality, is, well, now when you make an application or make a region on a page in an application, you can pick how wide it should be, right? And Apex kind of has this this grid layout that it uses, this 12-column grid. You can say, if you want something to be 50% of the page, you'd say it is 6 columns of the 12. If you want something to be 100% of the page, you say I want it to be 12 columns of the 12, and anywhere in between. But you'll notice that as you shrink your screen down, or you shrink your browser down, even though you declared that you want something to be 50% of the screen, at a certain point, Apex is going to say, well, that's all well and good. I understand that you want that, but the screen's too small to support that. That's just not reasonable at this point, at which case it will then take up 100% of the screen regardless of what you specify. So how can we take advantage of this idea of using media queries, and kind of what does it look like? So one of the things that I like to do is we're going to head on over here. And very briefly, I'm going to hop into CodePen, and I'm going to go ahead and make a new pen. Those of you who might not be familiar with CodePen, CodePen is basically a wonderful place for us to build kind of little ad hoc snippets, shareable snippets that are a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you can use any one of those technologies. You don't have to use all of them. And we're primarily going to focus on CSS. So let me go ahead and expand that here. And if I open up my little code sample, copy this, and paste this in here. Okay. So I just want to point something out. Notice that at the moment, my background is purple, and if we kind of try to look at the CSS, you can see that I have a color of red, orange, yellow, green, and purple. And as I make things smaller, and one thing to take in mind, it's hard to see. There's a number down here at the very bottom. It shows how wide the screen is at the moment, and or how wide the viewport is. You can see that it's currently at 1219, 1210, and then right as it drops from 1200 to 1100, you can see that it changes colors. Okay, and if I go down again, and I go down to the 992 size, you can see it changes, and then ultimately, if it gets small enough, I'm going to go ahead and hit red. So that's all well and good. One of the things that so why do we care about these colors? Why is this important? Well, it's not the colors that you should care about. Really, what you should care about is that Apex has some built-in functionality about what it means to have to manage regions, and as they scale to these different sizes. And these are kind of like the common breakpoints that Apex has provided some actionable resizing, or where some type of event happens on these different sizes. So I want to show you something. If I edit my page, and I'm going to add a region to this page, and we're going to call this a normal region. Notice that the column's automatic, column span is automatic, and if there's no other region here, then basically that's the same as saying that the column span is going to be 12. And you can see that this spans the whole width. And of course, if I drop this down to 50%, save and run, I'm sure this is familiar. Eventually, something's going to happen where you can see that it now takes up 100% of the screen, not just 50%. So what if I want to control this differently, right? What if I want this to expand 50% sooner, right? I don't want it to be, or I want it to span 100% sooner. I don't want it to be locked into 50% this long. How do we do that? Well, if we come over to our wonderful little application here, and actually, I think actually have a slide here. If you go to apex.oracle.com/UT, this is a shortcut that the Apex team has provided to get to the universal theme. There's a ton of information that is written there about kind of the universal theme and different things you could take a look at. Well, there's actually some built-in classes that you can leverage to help control kind of how big you want your region to be at what time. So in other words, if the screen, think of these like if statements. If the screen is large, then you pick the number of columns that you want. So we'll say .col-large-6 if the screen is large, be 6 columns or 50%. .col-md is if the screen is a medium size, then going to be this many columns, and then small, and then extra small, then of course extra, extra small. So I just want to point out that you could say that maybe if the screen gets to is greater than 992 pixels, I want it to be 60%. But the second it gets less than that, maybe I want it to be 100%. So how would we do that? Well, let's go to our region, and I'm going to make another region just so we can kind of compare. Okay, and it doesn't really matter what I put here in the column span. It's the column CSS classes that I'm interested in. So what I could do is I could say .col-large. I want to be 6 columns, and actually I don't need the dot. And then I'm going to say, well, when I get to a medium size, col-md, maybe I still want to be 6 columns. And then when I get to a small size, that's when I want to be 100%. And then I also just need to say that even when it gets even smaller than that, extra small, I want it to be 100%. So let's just see if that does anything different. Let's look at the behavior here. So now we can see that we have our region. This is the normal region behavior. And as I make this a little bit smaller, and we get smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually something's going to happen where I hit a new breakpoint. Okay. Now notice that my custom classes expanded sooner than the normal region. So sometimes if you want something to expand sooner, you can do so. And we can leverage media queries or some built-in classes that already are leveraging media queries to kind of cause these different scaling effects. Okay, and notice that it completely overrides whatever you pick here for a column and column span. So this completely overrode these supersede these declarative options. Okay, so you can thank Shakib. He kind of wrote the CSS in a pretty clever way so that it would allow us to be able to customize this behavior. All right, so that's media queries. And the biggest thing is positioning or scaling on your terms. And I guess the other thing that I'll say, I will make one other modification, one other region just for fun. and I'll duplicate this, and I'll just call this tiny region. And if you want something to be stuck at 6 or 50%, regardless, you can just keep coming in here. And there's one last set, the extra small, and I'll go ahead and set that to 6 as well. So now when I save and run this, you'll notice I kind of do the opposite, and I can say, well, don't resize yet. I want you to stay tiny. So that's going to stay 50% the entire time. Right? Well, there is a minimum width that it's going to hit eventually, but for the most part, it's not going to scale. Okay. All right. So I don't know how many people here are CSS gurus, or if they're just dipping their toe into what it means to write CSS. So just very quickly, I'm going to explain a couple of basic things about CSS, and then talk about a way in which we can think about approaching CSS and writing custom CSS in our applications. So the important thing to know is what a selector is, and a selector is a thing that lets us target a specific set of elements. Okay, think of it like a where clause. Okay, select all the elements where class equals this, ID equals this, element has this attribute. So those are all different types of selectors that we can use in our applications. And these selectors are just very, very, very helpful things. So I said kind of where class equals this, or where ID equals that. Those are all different types of selectors that we can use. And there's a whole array of selectors that you can pick from and leverage. One of the things that I always like to share, and I'll put this in chat, or I'll make sure it's available. There's a really fun game that I like to share, and it's called CSS Diner. And CSS Diner is a fun way to learn selectors. And even if you know a lot about CSS, sometimes this can be a helpful thing to come back and look at, just to make sure that you still have an idea of maybe there's some abstract selectors that you could leverage. But basically the way this works is it asks you to select an element. And in this case, it's asking us to select the plates. So we come over here and we'll type a tag selector or a type selector to select the plates. And notice that there's some discussion over here on the right side, which is talking about a particular type of selector. And you can bet that whatever they're talking about over here is probably what you're going to need to type in your fake little CSS editor over here. So I select the plates. You can see that it's happy. And then it gives me the next challenge. Again, it wants me to use a type selector, wants me to select the little bento boxes. If I try to select the plates again, you can see that my plate shook, said nope, not me. But if I type in my bento box, you can see that, oh, bento boxes go away, and I'm on to the next one. Now, this is the last one we're going to look at. We're not just going to do this whole thing. I just want to point out that it does gradually kind of turn the dial into in difficulty, and as well as exposing kind of new features and concepts. And notice now it's talking about an ID selector and using the hash. So if I said, I can see that there's a plate with an ID of fancy. So if I say hash fancy, I should get the fancy plate. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and leave that there, and I'll make sure this is available, but I'll also go ahead and I'll put that in chat. Okay. Okay, so close that. So what type of selectors should we seek out and should we use? Well, remember that Apex is a framework that has a lot of pre-generated code. There's a lot of pre-generated classes. There's a lot of stuff that's done for us that's very helpful. And if we want to modify that stuff, we have to visually, we're going to have to write some CSS to be able to target certain things and change them in a certain way. And I cannot stress this next statement enough. Stick to using single class selectors wherever possible. Okay, stick to using single class selectors wherever possible. And I would argue that there's almost no reason to ever use an ID selector in your CSS. Even if you're trying to target one thing on the page. And you might think, well, that doesn't seem possible. Why would we do that? I don't understand. Well, if you start thinking about writing things as classes wherever possible, classes by nature are reusable things. You can add that class to multiple elements, to multiple things. And so, sure, maybe on this page, at this moment, at this time, we only need to style this one thing. But whenever there's a feature or a request or something that a client or a customer wants, they tend to not just want it in that one spot. They tend to want it in multiple different areas. So whenever we think about writing our custom CSS in terms of writing classes, then we can reuse the code that we've written, right? We don't just have a whole bunch of one-off scenarios or one-off styles that we're using. We're building a framework. So how do we do something like that? And the way that we're going to approach this, or the methodology that we are going to use, is called BEM. And again, it stands for Block Element Modifier. And I mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. It's not a framework that you download. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to do anything special at all. This is just a concept or a way in which it's a guideline in which we can create our CSS classes. And it does two things that are critically important. One, it encourages consistent specificity. And I'll talk about what exactly that is here in a second. And it allows for the reuse and customization of some of the styles that we might create. So let's take a scenario here. And I'm going to I have a button on my screen, and I'm going to call it my button. And you can see that I get a little button that generates over there in the upper left-hand corner. And I get some requirements from our business that says they want buttons to look a certain way, and we say, yeah, no problem, I got that covered. So I'm going to write a little selector here, and I'm just write a couple small things. Maybe I want the border to be 1 pixel, a solid. We'll do like a really kind of a darker gray. And maybe I want the border radius just to be kind of soft. And then I'll add a little bit of padding here, so I have a little bit of spacing. And maybe I want to make sure that my font is the exact same color as my border. Maybe that's something that I think is helpful. There's a couple other things I can add, but that's all I'm going to do for now. And client says, great, I love the button. Ship it, we're good. Client comes back and says, hey, we'd like another button. You say, okay, but I want it to look different. I want it to be a different color. So, okay, so I say other button. And so at this moment, I kind of have an issue because I have no way of uniquely identifying the difference between a button. All buttons are the same. So already I kind of made a bad decision in that I just targeted all buttons, just blanket statement. These are what all buttons are going to look like. And that's not really what I wanted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to target a special class of BTN for button. And I just need to make sure now that my buttons have that class. And let me move this over a little bit. Okay. And that's good. But remember that I didn't want my other button or my new button to look the same. I wanted it to look a little bit different. So, well, what I'll do is I'll just change the class, right? So I'll come down here, I'll change this, and this time I'm gonna call this my primary button, and I'm gonna add primary button here to my class, and I'm just gonna change a couple things. I'm gonna say that I probably wanted a background color. And let me go ahead and change this to kind of like a really light gray, so a very high hexadecimal number. So we're gonna put this up at like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere around there. Yeah, that's pretty good. And I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna change this to like maybe a dark blue color. Ooh, let's do a light blue. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Okay. And let's just say that that's all I really needed to change for my primary button. User says great. But then the user comes back and they say, well, you know what? I decided that I saw this website that had these really round buttons, and I want our buttons to be more round. Okay, sure. So here's where kind of the issue starts to creep in. It's small at the moment, but it illustrates a key issue with what I've done here. Well, I'm going to say, sure, I'm going to go back to my button. I'm going to say, well, I want the border radius to be 6 pixels. Oops, 6 pixels. And you can see now I have a rounder button only for this one, but not for that one. So then I have to come down here and I have to say, well, you know what? Well, you're also going to be 6 pixels. And then, okay, now it's back to even. So I kind of have to do this double work to make sure that things stay consistent. Now, I'm not saying you're going to avoid double work for every single time, but let's try to limit the amount of times where we have to do something like that. So one of the things that we can do, one of the things that BEM challenges us to do, is to say, well, find the core common properties that make up a component. It turns out that this button class has all the core common properties that we're looking for. Okay. And then when you want to modify those core properties in some way, add a second class, add another class to decorate or change those styles. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say BTN, here it goes, dash dash primary. And now when I go to my class down here, BTN dash dash primary, notice that, look at all the overlap that I have between these two sets of styles. The only thing that's different is actually just my background's color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all of this out. And notice that my button still looks just slightly different. And also, if I change this border radius or this style and I change it back, notice that both buttons happily respond. Why is this important? This is important because this allows us to define, like, think of it like a base class, a base set of styles, and then we can kind of extend and tweak and customize what exactly particular instances of the button looks like. So for example, if I wanted to make a danger button, I might come down here, say button dash dash danger, and I might say that the background color is red. And let me make a button here. So I'll say button.btn.btn dash dash danger. And in here, I'll say danger button. And then now I have my red button. Maybe I don't like, in this instance, I don't like the black text against the red background. So in this case, I might actually say that the font color is also going to be white. Okay, so I can overwrite certain things to make certain combinations that I'm interested in. Okay. Now here's the real beauty of BEM. Notice that these classes are only really dealing with the text color and the background color. They're mostly just dealing with color. Nothing really to do with sizing, only the presentation of colors. So what I could do is I could also come in here and I could say, well, button dash dash large. I want to make a large button. And if I want something to be a large button, well, then I'm just going to change something about the padding. Maybe I want twice the padding. And so I can pick any one of these buttons now, and I can add the class btn dash dash large, and suddenly I have a large button. Okay. And excuse me. So now I can mix and match these different classes. I can reuse them in different scenarios for when they see fit, or where I see fit. And some of you might be kind of already putting this in place. That is exactly what Live Template Options is. What I just described was how Live Template Options has been implemented. When you click to set the body height for this, when I go in and inspect element on this, you can see that here it has this class of IH240. Or if I say header hidden, you can see there's a class here, t-region dash dash remove header. When I go pick accent 14, or at 4, t-region dash dash accent 4. So what this is saying is that I need the base t-region class, but go ahead and decorate it in a way so that accent 4 is applied. And the beautiful thing here, I just want to point this out, is if we look at all of these selectors over here on the right-hand side, a single class selector, a single class selector, a single class selector. This one's even less generic than that. But I just want to point out that single class selectors are what we're seeing used. And what this does is this makes it really easy to overwrite and customize these regions. And we can give Shakib a massive thank you for being so careful and deliberate with the way that he chose to write this CSS to give us the ability to very easily customize our code. Now, I don't know if anyone has tried to customize one of the earlier themes, but oftentimes it was a big pain. You would want to apply your style and it just wouldn't work. So you'd have to go in and try to figure out why. And my closing thing here is that notice that, again, everything here is single classes. So what this means is that these selectors are just as specific. So if I was to add an ID in here, called special, and I decided that special needs to have a background color of pink, notice that it's going to turn pink. And what's also really interesting is it doesn't matter where I put this in my CSS, it's going to remain pink. So if I later want to come in here and modify this in some way, change the color, I really can't because, or I have to make something even more specific than this ID selector, which it becomes hard to do. But if I just make a class and apply it later, I can make a special class button pink, right? Maybe it just needs to be, I just really need it to be pink. I can go ahead and I can add this to any button. I can reuse it, and it's going to go ahead and make my pink, make my button pink because it needs to be, whatever. Okay. All right. So this idea, I think, is critically important to writing maintainable and successful CSS. And this is exactly what live template options are. All live template options are doing at runtime, they're just changing the classes that are associated with these components, and the classes are just doing what they do. So really quickly, there you have block element modifier, and I talked about kind of that name, but I didn't really describe what exactly everything is. The gist is this: you have the block level, such as the base component, the button, the report, the region. You might have an element that is that's nested within inside that. So in the case of a table, it might be a header or a row. And then you might have a modifier saying that, oh, well, I want it to be borderless, or I want it to be horizontal borders only, or I want it to not show the header, or you have all these different variations that you can use. And so the way that we would do that, the way that would look, is you can see here that I have a table, and then notice I have table underscore underscore row, table underscore underscore data. So these are the different elements that are in the table block. This is a modifier changing the way that the particular table is going to look. Table striped, table no outer border. And in a slightly more complex example than what we had just a second ago, okay, you can see that I have different button sizes. And then you can also see that I've removed my borders, I've added striping, and here's just a couple different examples here about how that might work. Okay. Notice for the most part, I'm shooting for single classes. Okay, don't worry about the nitty-gritty details about a lot of that other stuff. Okay. Again, so that's what it looks like: block underscore underscore element dash dash the modifier. And again, it's important for specificity reusability, and most importantly, maintainability, because every line of code that you write is a line of code that you got to maintain. And there's an example, but we already looked at that. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at some JavaScript utilities and some things that are just kind of helpful. So the first one, the first thing that I like to point out is actually that Apex has a specific module for theme 42. And why should we care about this at all? Well, we should care about this because in theme 42, it has a lot of utility functions. It has a lot of pre-selected elements that you can just reference. And it also helps us kind of create predictable behavior. So let's take a look. So the first one that I think is kind of interesting is toggle widgets. And there are one of the things that I like about the way the universal theme has been approached and just kind of the direction that Apex is headed is that the development team is getting much better at writing reusable widgets and integrating that into the themes, you know, kind of rather than writing a lot of just custom specific single-use widgets, right? Because no one wants to do that. You don't want to write something that can only be used in one narrow scenario. You want to write something that can be kind of leveraged all over the place. So toggle widgets is basically an API that lets us, well, toggle a widget, make it collapse or expand. And if I go to an Apex page, I'm pressing F12 to open up my console, and notice that, you know, if I type Apex, you can see that I get a namespace here that this Apex namespace that I can reference. And if I say dot, you can see that it's going to show me all the different modules that are attached, or modules and properties that are attached to this namespace. And if I go down a little bit, you can see that there is a namespace specifically for theme 42. So I'll go ahead and select that. And in here, there's all sorts of goodies. And I can see right here that there is a function for toggle widgets. And if I pass in a value, or I'm sorry, and you say expand widget, and I run that, you can see that my navigation bar has expanded. And if I come over here, I can say collapse widget, nav, and it collapses. So why do we care about this? Well, I've seen a lot of code where, you know, developers would do something like this. They'll figure out, like, oh, if I click on this, this is gonna expand my widget or toggle my widget in some way. So you'll go in and you'll inspect this. You'll find the button, and there might be some class selector or some ID. Okay, there it is, tnav control. You'd probably go in here to your console. You'll say, you know, go find this button, and then I want to actually, on that button, I want to trigger a click event, and that's going to kind of cause things to happen, right? But you don't really have as much control on whether or not you want it to expand or collapse. You're just saying, do the opposite of whatever you are. So you have kind of a more reliable way to kind of control that particular widget. Okay? And the same thing is true if you have a right panel on the screen. You can open and close the right panel. I will say scenarios where I've used this, I have used the right panel before as the basically a lot like the property screen in that we have in Apex. So like when you click on a component over here, you have the property screen that refreshes over here. So I have developed some user interfaces where as you play around, or you actually where you would drag and drop and customize things over here in the center, and then you'd have the right panel. Kind of when you select something, if it's not expanded, I'll make sure that the right panel is now expanded so that you can view the properties. Right. So that's another helpful thing there. You can configure success messages. So configure success messages, auto close a successful message. You can see that apex.theme42.configure success messages is something that you can invoke. And it's basically going to say that, well, I want to make sure that my success message is automatically dismissed and the duration is going to be 5 seconds. Now, as of Apex 18, or I think even in Apex 5.1, they made this the default behavior. But in Apex 5, we had to kind of go in and configure things a little bit differently. But so I'm happy to actually see this change. All this is really doing at the moment is just increasing the linger duration because by default, I believe it's 3 seconds, and we're just upping this to 5 seconds. The other thing that this has that I think is really helpful are there are pre-selected elements. So if you're writing JavaScript and you want to do something to the body content, or you want to do something to the header, or you want to modify the page title in some way, instead of having to try to kind of write different classes and select those things by yourself, well, you can actually just reference these pre-selected elements that the Apex team's kind of giving to you, saying, here we're going to make sure that these are targeting what you're expecting. Go ahead and reference these and use these, and that way in the future, if we need to change our class or we need to do something different for what it means to be the header, well, guess what? Your code will make sure that it's kind of referencing that object still. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Apex theme42 dot, and now if I say header $, you can see that it actually returns the header of my page, and I can do something like header dot. I think this is a jQuery object because there's the $sign there, so I could say something like hide, and you can see that my header goes away. And if I come back, I can say show, and now my header is back. And this is true for even really large sections of the page, such as theme42, and actually dot. You could say like my body content. Now you can see that the body content is actually missing now. And of course, I can bring it back. Hide and show are just common jQuery methods. There's nothing custom or special about that. I'm just asking jQuery to do what it does. Okay. And if you don't want to use the pre-selected elements, but you want the actual name of the class to use, in a similar way, there are some things that are in all caps. So there's body content, and that's actually going to give you the selector to get the body content. So in other words, I could do this myself, where I could say, okay, jQuery, go ahead and get the body content, and then go ahead and hide the body content. Okay, so that's another way that you could go about doing it. So if you want to pass in those values because you need to retain them for something later, you totally can. or maybe you're trying to generate some CSS or styles or something to manipulate the page in some way. You can go ahead and use that. So in conclusion, media queries control the look and feel for different resolutions or different screen sizes. And there are those custom classes that you can leverage. And I don't think I actually showed you the page. I want to show it to you so we have it. apex@oracle.com/UT for universal theme. And I believe it's under design. I think it's under design. And I believe it's under grid layout. And you can see right here, it's just showing you the different column sizes, and it's showing you the class prefix that you can use to manually control the size of your regions. BEM is a wonderful methodology for writing CSS. It stands for Block Element Modifier. It strives to have consistent CSS, consistent specificity. It allows you to write your code in your CSS in a modular, reusable way, and also a maintainable way. And lastly, we talked about the Theme42 namespace, which contains a ton of helpful utilities when it comes to trying to target different elements, invoke different functions, and just ultimately modify and work with Theme42, the universal theme. So I tried to end with about 5 minutes left in case there are any questions or comments. But I thank you so much for your time. And yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
At this point, I have one, but I'll let people also write. If you have any questions, just drop it in the question box, and I'll pick it up for Tyson.
Yeah.
Jürgen asked, when you were doing the class names and stuff with the underscores, pretty much question is,
Yeah.
when are you using underscore in your class names, and sort of why?
Oh, great question. So if I come back here, notice that and the best example I can think of is table. So a table consists, there's three primary elements there. There's the main table, there's the table row, and there's a table data. All three of those elements constitute are being part of that table component. You can't really have the table row without the table, and you can't really have the table data without the table row. So these are all core parts of the table component. So I have the table component, and when I use underscore, I'm basically just saying that this is another element that could potentially be modified in its own way, but it's just a part of the core table component. So this is basically saying it's a sub-element of a core component. The dashes indicate that they're a modifier. They're basically saying that I want to change the way that the table displays. So basically, all of the template options that you see in the universal theme are modifiers. So when you come in here, and let me show my content here, and I say quick edit, and I pick live template options. Anytime I pick one of these options, you'll see that, and if I actually, I do need this open. Anytime I pick something here, you can see that it adds the -- remove header. How come it's not an underscore? Well, it's not an underscore because it's just modifying the region. It's not like a new element, a new sub element of the region. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's fine. At this point, I don't have any other questions, but we can leave it for if there's one coming in. How would I collapse a collapsible region with a dynamic action?
How would you collapse a collapsible region with a dynamic action? So I do believe that there's an event that is hooked onto those. Off the top of my head, I don't know what exactly it is, but let me show you something, because this is something that this is actually what I would do. I have downloaded on my computer at all times. I have the most recent version, or whatever version of Apex that I'm working with. And so if I come here, and actually I just have it right on my desktop, here's Apex 18.1. And I want to show you something. If I go to this images folder, it's kind of a poorly named folder, but it kind of is what it is at the moment. This is basically all of the static assets that are served with Apex. And in particular, I'm interested in one of the libraries that Apex is using. In fact, all of the Apex widgets and components are kind of added into the page in this Apex library. So even though it's kind of a core part of Apex, they still treat it like a library. So I'm going to go into libraries. And then in here, I can see there's actually a folder for Apex. And I bet if I go in here, under widget, there's probably going to widget collapsible. And so I can actually open this up and I can take a look at the code. So I'd have to go find exactly what it is. But I bet somewhere in here, there's an expanded and a collapsed class, but I would bet somewhere in here there's an event that I could trigger. So I don't know. I don't know if I can find it off really quickly. I was hoping maybe it'd be towards the top. But yeah, in here would give me my answer. And that's where I would have to look. But off the top of my head, I don't have it.
Yeah. Oh, good, and we can take heavy for that. The other one that I have is, what would you suggest as being a best place to put common or shared CSS? Would you put it on page 0 or somewhere on a web server thing, like a file directory?
Yeah, so ultimately the best answer is a separate file, right? You want your own CSS file. But if you can't, let's say workflow is, it's hard to kind of get a workflow created to kind of get your file onto a server, get your CSS file onto a server that you can reference by your app. One of the things that I really like is that if you pop open ThemeRoller, there is, if this ever opens, a custom CSS section down here. So I can actually define a class, like maybe I want to make a class called body -- pink, something like that, and I can say background color pink. Okay, BACK body pink. Yep, I think that's good. And now what I can do, I'm going to save as. I'm going to call this, Tyson's styles. Okay, and I'm going to set this as current. Now I could go into any page at this point, and I should be able to inject a class onto my page. I'm going to call it body pink, save and run. And if I did this correctly, fingers crossed, now I have a pink body. And I can do this to any page. I can go create a new page and give it the body pink class, and it'll have a pink body. Now, ultimately, this would be better served in a CSS file, kind of put on your web server somewhere, but this is a really good next best option.
Yeah, no, I would think that page 0 is kind of pre-5.0 method of putting CSS somewhere nicely, like a global thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All good. Look, Tyson, at this point, I don't have any other questions.
Well, awesome. Thanks for having me. This was a blast. And if you have any other future questions for me, you can always send me an email, tyson.jouglé@skillbuilders.com. That's TYSON.JOUGLET. Yep. And thank you so much for having me.
No worries, Tyson. Look, if anyone wants to reach out, Tyson, just reach out to me, and I'm happy to share his details as well, or have any questions afterwards about the session as well. So I'm sure Tyson will be happy to help.
You bet.
Tyson, thanks a lot for being today with us. I think we can conclude.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, you bet. Take it easy. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, guys, for being with us. It was session number 4. I'm just gonna show you one of my screens that I have. If I can take over from Tyson, so I'll just try to. Next session is on the Thursday, so just bear in mind it's Thursday, August 9, which is 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Time. That should be 4 a.m. in US Eastern Time, and that should be like 10 a.m. in Central Europe. So wherever you are, hopefully you're going to be there with us. And please let people know about the webinar series. And thank you also, Australian Oracle User Group, for having us today. Appreciate it. Thank you. And bye.